following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back. Retro Rangers. George Grimm, the host. I'm going to turn it over to you, George. Have a great show, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Ralph. We're here with Bock, former AP sports writer and author of many books on many sports. And we also have Gil Martin, author of a book called Ice Wars about the Ranger-Islander rivalry, which we're going to talk about tonight. Gil also has a sports podcast on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio on Tuesday nights. I was lucky enough to be on there Tuesday, and we didn't blow up the joint, so I guess I did okay.
You did just fine.
Okay. Okay, New York has had its share of great sports rivalries between the Mets and Yankees, Jets and Giants, Dodgers, Giants, Knicks and Nets. But, you know, there haven't been any that have been so intense as the Rangers and Islanders for the past 47 years. The Islanders came in the NHL in 1972 with the Atlanta Flames, which increased the number of teams in the NHL to 16. The Islanders were brought in by Nassau County, basically, because the World Hockey Association Raiders wanted to use the Nassau Coliseum. The people in Nassau County didn't want anything to do with the WHA. They didn't think it was a major league organization, and they figured the only way they could legally bar them from playing there was to get their own NHL team. So they brought in Bill Shea, who was very instrumental in bringing the Mets to New York in 1962, and he found two allies in the president of the NHL at the time, Clarence Campbell, and president of the Rangers at the time, William Jennings. William Jennings thought that it was a win-win-win for him, because if he could keep the Raiders out of Nassau Coliseum, the only place they could play in New York would be Madison Square Garden. So he could charge them exorbitant rents, give them bad dates to play on, and basically kind of help them, fail. And then when the Islanders came in, the Islanders were forced to pay the Rangers a heavy fee for playing in their area, and so that was a win for them too. So that's how the Islanders came to be, and that was 47 years ago in 1972. So, Gil, what are the highlights of the rivalry?
Oh, gosh. So many highlights of this rivalry going back to the very beginning. And, in the first year, the Rangers just dominated the Islanders, winning all 6 games, including a couple of 6-0 games on back-to-back nights. And it just looked like a very one-sided rivalry, but that really all changed back in 1975 when all of a sudden the Islanders started to get good under Al Arbor and they made the playoffs, and that little mini 3-game series in 1975 that really made the rivalry what it is today. It sort of started everything off, and the Islanders came up with the unbelievably shocking overtime goal by J.P. Parise that won the series just a couple of seconds into overtime, and then all of a sudden the Islanders were on their way to a great decade of hockey, and the great Ranger teams under Emil Francis. Within a few months, those teams would be dismantled. Vic Hatfield would be out of town. Ed Jockerman, Joe Villemure, all of these players would be either traded or released, and all of a sudden the Rangers were rebuilding. But nobody.
the end of the Emil Francis era right there. You know, you didn't have to wait till the next year when John Ferguson came in. That was the end of the era right there when they lost that series. I interviewed some of the players on the Rangers, and that you know, they were all kind of shocked at the fact that they lost. They didn't think they would lose the series. They were all very upset that it was a short 2 out of 3 series, but that's what it was. That everyone was playing a 2 out of 3 series, and
George,
went home.
George, the reason for that was that the Islanders were hapless, and I remember talking to Bill Torrey, the general manager, and we had used that word kept showing up in copy about the Islanders, the hapless Islanders, and he was so offended by that. He said, "Why do you call us hapless?" I said, "Well, Bill, look at the record, you know."
Yeah.
As Bill Parcells once said, "You are what you are." You know, you look in the mirror, and that's who you are. So those first couple of years, they were truly bad, and they had a number of coaches, and in fact, I believe they had 2 ex-Rangers for brief periods who were coaches. Earl Ingerfield, I think, coached for them, and I think Phil Goyette also spent some time behind the bench for the Islanders.
Right.
Yeah, those were the first 2 coaches. Goyette was first, and he really was sort of overmatched. Very nice guy, very good hockey player back in the day, but couldn't really coach the expansion team. And Ingerfield was sort of a caretaker, interim coach after Goyette was let go. And then in the second year, they brought in Al Arbor, who Bill Torrey had a connection with, and then Arbor chopped 100 goals off their goals against in his first season, which was the Islanders' second season, and they improved, but they still missed the playoffs, and very quickly in their third year, they had the same number of points as the Rangers, 88, and then you had that big playoff series.
Yeah. Well, in 1972, they were complaining to the Islanders that half the players that they picked in the expansion draft ended up in the World Hockey Association. So both Goyette and Ingerfield were complaining that they didn't have any players. They didn't have any NHL players. And in fact, the Flames, who came in that year, had a 25, 38, and 15 record, while the Islanders only won 12 games. They lost 60 games, and they tied 6 games. So the Flames, either they picked better, they coached better, or they didn't get hit by the World Hockey Association so badly.
Yeah, the Flames ended up with more of the players that they drafted, and the Islanders concentrated more on the annual draft than the expansion draft, and they were able to secure Dennis Potvin after having that terrible first season where they set a record for futility, which was broken 2 years later by the Washington Capitals in their first year. But, they basically ended up with the worst record in the league, but were able to draft Dennis Potvin, and Bill Torrey turned down a lot of very big offers for that draft pick that, could have gotten him, 5 number 1 picks, even Emil Francis, and I interviewed Emil for this book, and he mentioned, he made an offer as well to Torrey to try to get Dennis Potvin on Broadway, but of course we all know that never really happened.
Okay, so speaking of Dennis Potvin, when did he begin to suck?
Depends who you ask, doesn't it? Well, that all came to bear in February of 1979 when Potvin checked Ulf Nielsen, and Nielsen got his skate caught in a rut in the Garden Ice, and you can ask Dale Rolfe about the Garden Ice, and a number of other players as well. But Nielsen got hurt, and the Ranger fans just never really forgave Potvin after that, and then he just played some of his best hockey against the Rangers, and all of a sudden the chant was born, and here we are. How long has it been since Dennis Potvin retired? 35, 40 years almost, and they're still chanting after him. So,
The Islanders fans can't chant 1940 anymore, but Rangers
No.
fans still chant.
Well, there's another thing here. Torrey had to convince Al Arbour. Al Arbour didn't want to come to New York.
That's correct.
He had bad thoughts about living in New York, and Torrey had to, take him around, take him to the suburban Long Island and the nice areas that we have here on the island, and he had to sweet talk Al Arbour into taking that job, and it was a good thing for all concerned. It made everything that Arbour touched turn to gold, and there came a time in 1980 when the Islanders won the Stanley Cup for the first of 4 straight years, which was awfully humbling to the Rangers, who hadn't won the Cup since 1940 and kept being reminded of it by Islander fans who would chant 1940. So that stretch of 4 straight Stanley Cups established the Islanders as the kings of New York hockey, even though the Rangers were playing in the Shrine, the Madison Square Garden, probably the best arena. But the Islanders were the team that were marching around with the cup. So that was a very embarrassing period for the Rangers.
And you add to that the fact that the Islanders beat the Rangers in the playoffs in 81, 82, 83, and 84. And, the Rangers had some very good teams back then. You had Herb Brooks and Craig Patrick running that team, and they had a unique style with, Herb Brooks was ahead of his time with the way they would pass backwards and weave in and out. It worked so well in college. It worked so well in the Olympics in 1980. It worked well in the NHL, and the Rangers were, certainly a top 10 team, some years maybe even a top 5 team, but they couldn't get past the Islanders every year in those playoffs.
Yep. Except, in 1979 they got past them, but that was before the Islanders started winning cups. So.
Right, and that was such a big deal for the Rangers and their fans, and John Davidson, who really stood on his head. And, the Rangers had a strategy in that playoff series to try to make Dennis Potvin play the puck and then, forecheck him and force him to cough it up. And that was one of the few times that it actually worked. And Freddie Shero, who was coaching the Rangers back then, that plan worked out very well. And Davidson was outstanding in that series. And the Rangers, it was the closest they came to winning a cup in so long because the excitement generated by that playoff win. The Islanders had the best record in the league that year, if I'm not mistaken. And just upsetting the Islanders that year was just incredible for the Rangers. And there was such a buzz in New York City about hockey at that point. It was unbelievable how intense that rivalry got.
Right. Yep. Those were the days. So, what other highlights can you mention of the rivalry?
Well, to me, the best single game in the rivalry, I have to go back to the 1984 playoff series. And, the Islanders were, at that point, the 4-time defending Stanley Cup champions. The Rangers, under Herb Brooks, had a very, very good team. They went up in that series. It was a best-of-5 series back then, the first round. The Rangers went up 2-1, but Barry Beck, their captain, got hurt. And the Islanders managed to win Game 4. You have Game 5 back at the Coliseum. An overtime game. The Rangers had some golden opportunities to win that game in overtime, but couldn't do it. And then, of all people, from a Ranger perspective, especially Ken Morrow gets the overtime goal, beats Glenn Hanlon. And Morrow was one of those guys. He would score 2-3 goals all regular season, but then in the playoffs he'd come up with some really big clutch goals for the Islanders, and that put away that series. But that one game in particular, to me, was the greatest single game in the rivalry. Just the intensity, the quality of play, what was at stake, and you talk to all of the players who took part in that game, and it was just an incredible experience for players on both sides, really.
Yeah. Now, was that the game that was sent into overtime by a questionable goal by Don Maloney?
Yes, Don Maloney, and when I interviewed Don for the book, I asked him, was that a legitimate goal? And he said, well, it depends when you asked me. If I was working for the Rangers, I would tell you yes. If I was working for the Islanders, I would just smile and say next question. So
that's right. He ended up working for the Islanders. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Don kept his sense of humor about it. But look, the goal did count, and that was in the final minute of regulation. And I think it was Mikko Leninen who had a great chance to win that game in overtime, but couldn't quite put the puck away. And then Morrow gets the goal, and Hanlon stood on his head in that game. He was outstanding.
Yeah, Mikko Leninen.
You mentioned Ken Morrow, and he had a remarkable double achievement, or daily double. I don't know. I guess that's what you'd call it. In 1980, he was a member of the Olympic hockey team that scored the miracle on ice in Lake Placid, beating the Russians and going on to the gold medal. And immediately after the games, he joined the Islanders, and what do you know? He's a Stanley Cup champion. Yeah. So within a couple of months, he achieved something that a lot of hockey players never come close to. A double header.
And I believe he was the first player to do that in the same year, where he won the gold medal and then won the Stanley Cup in the same year. And And the Islanders that year, also invented the playoff beard. That sort of originated with the Islanders back then, and Clark Gillies and those guys. And Morrow always, wore a beard and that was one of his trademarks, so to speak. And he pulled off that. He was the first player ever to win the gold medal and win the Stanley Cup in the same season.
He was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, yes, he was.
The Islanders fell on hard times when the team was sold to a charlatan who was introduced to them by Gary Bettman. John, I can't remember his last name. He wound up in jail. He did not have any money, but he bought the team for like a couple of months, and that was the start of a downfall for that team.
Right.
I don't know if he was responsible, but it certainly was a bad time for that franchise.
Well, one problem that the Islanders always had, and it sort of went back even to their first owner, Roy Bowe, they never really had a lot of money behind the team, whether it was an unwillingness to spend it or that they just didn't have it. Very often they were struggling with payroll, and when free agency came into hockey, in later years, like when Mike Milbury took over as the GM, anytime a player was up for a new contract, they were heading out of town, whether it was Ziggy Palffy or, whoever it was. They couldn't keep the talent that they traded for or they drafted and developed because they just weren't able or willing to spend the money.
Right.
And then there was that silly episode when they changed the logo.
Yeah.
The Gorton's Fisherman.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes,
you don't do that. That was
it was either the Gorton's Fisherman or Stan Fischler, one or the other. We couldn't tell.
One or the other, yeah. You're right.
Yeah.
But that was a bad time in the franchise's history. Yeah. And I'll tell you this. I was talking to somebody the other day, and now we've just opened the new season. And the Islanders, I guess they're 3-3 at this point, but you never know where they're playing. Are they going to be playing in the Barclays Center, or are they going to be playing in the Nassau Coliseum? It's right. I mean, you really have to apply yourself to find out where the games are being played. They don't have a home ice, and I just find that terrible. I just find that very bad for the team, for the image of the team and the league, frankly. And now they're building a new rink. They're building a new rink in Elmont, which isn't a popular thing with the locals that live there. But it's like they're like vagabonds, and I just think that that's terrible. The Rangers, good, bad, or indifferent, you'll always find them in Madison Square Garden.
That's right.
Very true, and they've been a part of that, of the Garden going all the way back to the 20s, and now, it's hard to believe the Rangers used to get kicked out of the Garden when the playoffs were played because the circus came to town, and now, of course, the circus is no more. But and in fact, it was a funny story. Up until the 70s, the Rangers would actually have to play a lot of their home playoff games either in Toronto or Montreal or somewhere else, Detroit, because they couldn't use the Garden. But in 1975, when the Rangers and the Islanders had that exciting 3-game series, and the Islanders won, there was the circus was in town at that point, and the animals were all there. And some of the Islander players, after they won the exciting overtime playoff game, they took a bag full of elephant dung, and that became sort of their good luck charm as they went through the playoffs. And then, if you recall that year, the Islanders were down 3-0 to the Penguins in the next round, won 4 straight, were down 3-0 to the defending Stanley Cup champion Flyers, tied the series at 3-3 before Kate Smith sang "God Bless America" and ended the Islanders' run in the 7th game of the semifinals. But the circus in the Garden ended up playing into what the Islanders turned into their good luck charm for that playoff run.
Well, Gil, I'm curious about your opinion about something. We've just discussed how the Islanders won 4 straight Stanley Cups, how the Rangers did not win a Stanley Cup for 50-odd years. And I'm wondering if you believe that the Islanders remain little brothers, second cousins, not the real, not the hockey kings of New York, even though they've had much more success than the Rangers.
I think so, and every player that I interviewed, and I interviewed more than 50 players for this book, and coaches and broadcasters and everything else, and everybody who was affiliated with both organizations at some point mentioned the difference between the two organizations, that the Rangers were the original 6, the established team, the playing at the glamorous Madison Square Garden and always playing to sold out crowds, or at least the tickets were sold almost all the time. Right. And then the Islanders were the younger brothers, the little brothers that didn't have as big a payroll, played at the less glamorous Nassau Coliseum. They were the blue-collar, we don't get a lot of respect team, while the Rangers were doing commercials for Sassoon jeans and, all making hockey sock rock and all of that stuff back in the late 70s and early 80s. Yeah. So, you had a very different culture. The Rangers were at Studio 54 and the Islanders were somewhere on Hempstead Turnpike. So, you had a very big contrast culturally, between those two teams. But I think, the Islanders were kings of the hockey world in the early 80s. They were the best team year after year after year. But as far as getting more media attention, getting more, books written about them, commercials, endorsements, cultural impact, the Rangers always seem to have that advantage. And, you think about those names on the Rangers in the late 70s, early 80s, Phil Esposito, Ron Duguay, Anders Hedberg, John Davidson, Dave Maloney. Those guys were all over the place, culturally, magazine ads, television ads, page 6, in the newspaper. The Islanders just, kind of played hockey, but they played it very, very well.
Yeah, they had a good team there. Let me ask you something. How many of those Islanders from that era ended up in the Hall of Fame, off the top of your head?
Well, you got Billy Smith, Trottier, Bossy, Potvin, Gillies, Al Arbor, Bill Torrey. If you're not doing players, but you're doing management, that would make 7. Yeah. And then you had some really very good players, not Hall of Famers, but you got your John Tonellis, your Stefan Pearsons, your Chico Resches, your Kelly Rudies. These were good, players that Bobby Nystrom is the kind of guy, you need a guy like that to win a championship, but he's not a Hall of Famer, No.
They just had a solid lineup.
Well, why do you think they didn't capture the imagination of New York? I mean, they're the Stanley Cup champions 4 years in a row. And yet, as you said, and I said earlier, they remain the little brothers, the poor, almost poor relations.
I think, you also have to remember back then, not everybody had cable. You had a handful of games on WOR Channel 9, maybe once or twice a week. And a lot of the time for the Islanders back then, the Ranger game would be on live at 7:30 on a Saturday night. And then after that was over, on tape delay, they would show the Islanders in Atlanta against the Flames, or whoever they were playing that Saturday night. But I guess among the younger generation, the people who were growing up in the 70s and 80s, the kids really took to the Islanders on Long Island. But most of their parents, if they were hockey fans, they were Ranger fans, and that's how they grew up. So you almost had a situation where it was almost generational, where the parents very often were Ranger fans, and the kids who grew up on Long Island would be Islander fans. And I remember, speaking to, I forget whether it was Eddie Jockman or Pete Stemkowski, but he said that rivalry got personal. And after the 1975 playoff series, the player goes into the deli where his picture was all the time, and all of a sudden his picture is down, and there's a photo of Bobby Nystrom up there and J.P. Parise, and so the rivalry sort of hit home, because the Rangers at that point were practicing in Long Beach. That's where they were based, and it really sort of hit home. It was a very local kind of a rivalry.
The irony is that the Rangers, certainly when I covered them and when I worked for them in the 60s, Long Island was their second home. They all lived on Long Island, and they practiced on Long Island here at Skateland in New Hyde Park.
Yep.
So,
and then to Long Beach after that.
Yeah, that's right, in Long Beach. They pretty much were trailblazers for hockey on Long Island.
Yeah, and Emil Francis helped set up the junior league in and around the city and the island and everything else. And he, the thing about Emil Francis, he really was responsible in so many ways for the growth of hockey in and around the New York metropolitan area.
He brought in the Metropolitan Hockey League, like you said, and he opened up the gates for more hockey in the area, as far as New Jersey and Long Island. If it wasn't for him, it just probably wouldn't have happened. At least not then, anyway.
Right, and then the other thing that happened when the Islanders were born, the Long Island Ducks, pretty much their days were numbered, because they had a minor league team in Comac for a couple of years of the WHA Chicago Cougars. They had the Long Island Cougars for a couple of years, but the Ducks, after the Islanders' first season, the Ducks were no more, and they were there for many, many years in the old Eastern League.
Yeah, a lot of old Rangers played for the Ducks. They came up through the Eastern League, and they played for I know Jules Villemure did, and I did, and Eddie Jockman.
Yeah.
They both played for the.
And there was an era here in New York hockey, when the Rangers shared the Garden with the New York Rovers. So they had two teams playing in Madison Square Garden, and it was not I think it was a friendly relationship that those two teams had. The Rovers would play in the afternoon on a Sunday, and the Rangers would take the ice at night. Now, the Rovers went out of business during World War II, I guess. They became the Americans for a while, the New York Americans, and then they just faded away. But there was not the kind of animosity that the Rangers and the Islanders developed. They were kind of, you can play here too, as long as you pay the rent.
Right.
Okay, when did Pat LaFontaine come into the mix?
Well, I mean, he joined the Islanders after the 1984 Olympics, but his big moment in the rivalry came in that 1990 playoff series, and infamously at the end of Game 1, now the Rangers finished in first place in the division that year. The Islanders, fourth place in the division, barely making the playoffs. But, the Islanders in Game 1, it was a close game. Pat LaFontaine, by far the Islanders' biggest weapon. And, he was hurt it was a fluke. I mean, even LaFontaine himself and almost every player I interviewed and spoke to said it wasn't a dirty or intentional hit on the play, but he got injured. Was lost pretty much for the series. He did come back and try to play, but he really wasn't very effective. But at the end of that game, two things happened. First of all, you had a big brawl on the ice where Al Arbor sent out, his tough guys with like 2 seconds left in a face-off in the, at the other end of the ice where you knew the game was over, and he was just trying to send a message as they did back then. And then the ambulance that was trying to take LaFontaine to the hospital was blocked by some overzealous fans, and they were rocking the ambulance and wouldn't let it leave the Garden to take Pat LaFontaine to the hospital. So lots of fines, some suspensions after that big game. The Rangers ended up taking the series in 5 games, and then, of course, ironically, Pat LaFontaine finished his career as a member of the New York Rangers.
Right. That's the way hockey is. You end up in different places. What about 1994 when the Rangers beat them 4 straight? Ron Hextall beat 4 straight.
Yeah, Ron Hextall had a terrible series. Didn't even last all 4 games. What was the goal differential? Something like 22-3 or something. 6-0 in the first 2 games, and
had 2 shutouts.
Richter had the back-to-back shutouts at the Garden, and that series really sort of gave everybody notice that the New York Rangers in 1994 were a team to be reckoned with. They made a lot of deals at the trade deadline to bring in, Stefan Matteau and Craig McTavish and Glenn Anderson, and whether or not they were going to mesh as a team, wasn't really clear, and yet that playoff series showed that, this team had depth, this team could dominate, and the fact that they got through the Islanders so easy surprised everybody because, you think in a rivalry situation like that in a playoff series, the Islanders would at least be competitive, and they were not competitive. Like maybe part of the last game, they kept it close for a couple of periods, but that was probably the most one-sided series in the history of the rivalry.
It's been a lot of fun. I'll tell you that it's done a lot for hockey. The rivalry has done a lot for hockey in this area, and it's created a lot of interest. And you can't say anything bad about it. I mean, I understand the feelings between the two teams have not always been cordial, but I think the rivalry has done a lot for hockey. I remember the 6-team league. That's how old I am, and the Rangers were like an afterthought here in New York, even in New York, for all the other pro teams, because the Rangers would always be in a battle for 4th place. The first 3 places were going to go to Montreal, Toronto, Chicago, or Detroit, and the 4th place would probably be Chicago or Detroit, and that would leave the Rangers and the Bruins battling it out for hoping to finish 4th and usually finishing 5th and 6th. So the Rangers were really an afterthought here in New York for many, many years, and I think the arrival of the Islanders to give them a rival, a natural rival, really did a lot to build up hockey in New York and build up, as you said before about Emile, youth hockey here in New York and leagues for the kids, and that meant a lot. I mean, for the game, I think.
And then, that bore fruit. You had a guy like Nick Fotiu, who was born in Staten Island and became the first native New York City-born player to play for the Rangers, having that system. And then you had the Mullen brothers who grew up playing in Hell's Kitchen, and one of them ended up playing for both teams. So you have a situation where, that growth of hockey paid dividends. And the other thing is this, and it never ceased to amaze me, the fans got real intense and the fans disliked the other team. But I think both the fans and even more so the players, when you interviewed them, the amount of respect for the other team was extremely high. And they gave their all and they disliked each other on the ice. But off the ice, there was so much respect for the other team. Both as players and as people, that it really that came through on all the interviews that I did. And, they did charity softball games in the summer and raise money. And there was a lot of things. But one funny story that Bobby Nystrom told me, he was injured at one point. He was in the hospital, and Nick Fatiou went to visit him and see how he was doing. And Nick Fatiou brought him like a little box of cookies. So he's like, oh, yeah, I was in the hospital. He brought me cookies. And based on what you saw on the ice, you just couldn't imagine that in a million years, coming in with a little box of cookies in a string, from the bakery and bringing in the cookies. But, so much respect off the ice between the two organizations. And, these guys remember so many things about the rivalry fondly. And when I interviewed these people, the players, they talked about the very first time Glenn Healy was at the Nassau Coliseum for a Ranger-Islander game, and it was like a half hour before the game, and he just heard this noise coming from he's in the locker room getting dressed. What's that noise? What is that buzzing sound? It was the crowd. They were chanting and yelling and screaming in the game. They hadn't even come out for warm-ups yet. So the intensity of that rivalry, what it meant, what it turned, it turned many regular season games, played in November or February that most people would not remember. It made them memorable because of the atmosphere is a playoff atmosphere no matter when these two teams get together.
Now, all that being said, don't you think it's a sin that the Rangers and their own only meet 4 times during the regular season?
Yeah, and that they haven't met in the playoffs since 1994.
Right.
I mean, you go back 75, 79, 81, 2, 3, 4, 90, 94, and then nothing since then. And I can only imagine in this day and age with social media and the 24-hour news cycle and YouTube and Twitter and all of that, if these two teams met in 2019, 2020, 2021 in the playoffs, this area would go berserk. I mean, the coverage and the intensity of it would be on a whole different scale that wasn't available in 1994 and before that, when you still had to wait for the newspaper to come out the next day before you could read about what happened in the game.
Sure.
Well, that said, I think the absence of a home rink, a truly home rink, where you play your 35 or your 50 or your 70 games, it hurts the Islanders. It really does. Where are we playing tonight? The Coliseum or Barclays? It's just wrong. I mean, it's just wrong. Pick a rink and play there,
It is wrong. And, here's the problem that the Islanders are facing right now. The Coliseum is home. It's where the fans are most comfortable. It's closer to where the fans live. It's got better sight lines for hockey than Barclays. But it doesn't have the luxury boxes. The league isn't happy there. Quite honestly, the Coliseum should have been replaced in the mid-'90s, maybe even a little bit sooner than that. Give it 25 years. It was finished in 1972. Certainly by 1995, 2000, it should have been replaced. Nassau County and the town of Hempstead dropped the ball several times, and local politics got in the way, and you had the Democrats controlling whether it was the county, and I think the Republicans had the town, and nobody politically could please both sides and get anything done, and they had a couple of votes that didn't go well, but overall, the Coliseum should have been renovated or replaced way before it did, and as bad as Brooklyn was in a lot of ways, having Barclays Center to go to kept the Islanders in the metropolitan area and kept this rivalry alive. So if they end up in Belmont, it's better geographically and convenience-wise than Brooklyn, and hopefully, they'll build a good hockey arena. Barclays is a very nice place to go for a concert or a basketball game, but for hockey, it's just not a great place to watch a game, and it's very inconvenient for most of the Islanders fan base as compared to the Nassau Coliseum.
Well, you got to take the Long Island Railroad and change at Jamaica.
and change at Jamaica. But if the game ends at 11 o'clock at night, they're running one train an hour out of Jamaica to most places. And
Boomer Jeffrey on when he became coach of the Rangers. I remember talking to him one day, and I said, "Well, how do you like living here in New York?" And he said, "All I know is you change at Jamaica."
the three words no hockey fan wants to hear at midnight on a Tuesday,
You're right. You're right about that.
So, and the other thing is this, when they played at the Coliseum, you bring a carload of people in, and it costs you, let's say, $10, $15, whatever it was to park. You take the Long Island Railroad there, it costs you $15, $20 per person to take the Long Island Railroad to a game.
Right, you're right.
So it's a whole different setup, and it worked in that it kept the team in the area, but you got the feeling that Brooklyn was never really going to be their permanent home. They didn't market the team in Brooklyn the way they could have if that's what they had in mind. And it just didn't work. But yet, if they get this arena built in Elmont and near Belmont Park there, that's accessible by railroad, or at least it will be. It's right off the Cross Island Parkway. It's not far from the Grand Central, the Northern State. That is better than Brooklyn geographically. And if it's a good hockey arena, it'll keep the Islanders in the area. It'll keep the rivalry intense, and I think it'll serve its purpose. But Brooklyn worked out in the long run if the team gets their new home, and as difficult as it was and as awkward as it was at times, it served its purpose.
Its main asset is it's on Long Island, and
geographically anyway, yeah.
Exactly, and the Islanders are a Long Island franchise. Or
right.
It should be viewed that way.
Yeah, but if you ask 100 people who live in Brooklyn, are you a Long Islander? I don't think more than 3 of them would say yes.
No, you're right. You're right.
Culturally, Brooklyn is part of the city.
Right.
You're right. It is.
Now, back in the early '90s, I think it was the early '90s, the Rangers and Islanders were playing an exhibition game, and Dan Cloutier got into a big fight with the Islander goalie Tommy Salo.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah, that was a classic moment, and Kenny Albert was calling the game for Fox, and and then Cloutier ends up challenging the Islanders bench, and that was like a throwback to the 70s. I almost expected Dave Schultz and Don Selesky to come out onto the ice for the next shift. That was an outrageous moment, and one of those things that you didn't see too much when it happened, and nowadays you almost don't see it at all. So that was just one of those crazy, crazy moments that only a rivalry game, something like that, could happen in.
Well, one of the Islanders was getting beat up by a Ranger. I don't remember who, and I don't think anyone was able to help him because everyone else was tied up with somebody else, and so Tommy Salo left his crease to help his teammate, and Cloutier skated down and led to the ice, and they got into a big fight. And then I guess he was, like you said, he was all charged up, and he challenged the bench, and nobody.
No takers on that challenge, and it was that was just a crazy incident, and Cloutier lost his jersey. He's walking around in his undershirt, skating around in his undershirt, and challenging the Islanders bench, and it's amazing because even when the two teams are both struggling, the intensity level ratchets up when these two teams take the ice against each other, and it just creates a different atmosphere for both the fans and the players. And it's one of the things, rivalries have always been one of the things that makes hockey great. And you were talking about the days of the original 6, and you had Montreal and Boston, and Montreal and Toronto, and the Rangers in Boston, and you just had back in the original 6 days, the teams would take trains in between, play a home and home. And, that created a whole different set of rivalries. You play every team 22 times a season. You play them on back-to-back nights. You get a little hatred going. And I think especially the playoffs between the Rangers and the Islanders sort of just duplicated that intensity, that hatred, that real feeling of we got to get these guys, and it was just great for the game, really great for the game.
Now, do you think it's odd that in the 47 years that the Islanders have been here, that the Rangers and the Islanders have only made 2 trades?
I think it's one of those situations where the teams are tentative and kind of scared that if you trade a really good player to your biggest rival and they come back and beat you, it blows up in your face. And I think that sort of is the reason for the reluctance. I interviewed Neil Smith. I interviewed Don Maloney, both of whom served as general manager of these respective teams. Both of them said, yeah, I would make a trade, but nobody ever did. And I think the main reason was just fear of having it blow up in their faces like that.
Well, it's the same thing in baseball with the Mets and the Yankees. You'll never see the Mets and Yankees make a deal because they'd be afraid, but they're in the same market. And if I trade you a player and he suddenly becomes one of the best players in baseball, I look like I have pie in my face. So they're not going to take a chance.
Yeah, and then every time that player does well, it's they make the back page of all the tabloids and get the headlines on the newscast, and it reminds the fans, hey, we had this guy, what happened? So that is definitely why there haven't been a lot of trades.
Now there's been the players who have played for both teams, but not many trades. Only 2 trades. Ron Stewart got traded to the Islanders in 1972, and a few years ago, Glenn Sather sent. Going to try to venture this guy's name. He's a Finn, and I'm not going to venture his name. He got traded. He ended up with the Islanders. So
but you notice neither one of those were blockbuster deals, and one of them was, Ron Stewart was a useful player back in the day, but by the time he joined the Islanders, that was his last season as an active player, and that was. What did they? I think that was even a deal for cash, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So we're not talking about major blockbuster deals here, and but a lot of players have played for both teams. Pat LaFontaine, Brian Mullen. You can go Don Maloney. You can go through Glenn Healy. You can go through a pretty long list of players who have played for both teams. And Arnie Brown, Ron Stewart, and that always keeps it interesting when you have guys who have been on both sides of the rivalry.
Brian Trottier even became coach of the Rangers for a short period.
An unfortunate
interim.
Well, for anybody, and that just never felt right. And it just never felt right. And Trottier admitted as much when I spoke to him and for the book. But he talked about it at length. And when you're looking to break into coaching in the NHL, there's only so many jobs out there, and when you get an opportunity, it's hard to say no.
Yeah. Now the rumor was that he wrote, Glenn Sather, a 90-page handwritten essay about why he should be the Ranger coach. Was that?
Yeah, is that right?
He had a detailed plan. Right? Yeah, he had a detailed plan all worked out. He impressed him with the way he thought everything out and wrote everything down and had things all planned out. It just didn't come to fruition. No. Look, you got to also remember that was when. That was before the salary cap saved Glenn Sather from himself, basically, as general manager of the Rangers. So, that he was signing the biggest name free agents every year at that point, but he wasn't building a team.
No. How about now? What's the outlook for the Islanders now? This year.
Well, the Islanders made the playoffs last year, surprised a lot of people. If their goaltending holds up, I think that they can contend for the playoffs again. Robin Lehner, who was so good for them last year, is now in Chicago. But look, the Islanders have an improved defense, and I think the biggest thing going for the Islanders right now is, their coach and their general manager, Barry Trotz, probably a future Hall of Famer, Lou Lamoriello, Hall of Fame general manager. Those guys know what they're doing. You get the feeling that they'll keep the team in contention for quite a while just because they're so good at what they do.
Right. Yeah. And, as far as the Rangers, I think they're in very good hands now with John Davidson. I think they have a lot of skill up front, which will cover up some of their weaknesses on defense. I'd like to see Kako. Anytime I say his name, I have to stop and make sure I got my capos in front of my.
Got to make sure the first and the last name goes last. Yeah, I know.
I think he's going to be a star sooner or later, and I think they'll be okay. I don't think the fact that they only played 3 games in 2 weeks now helped them at all. Because a young team, you got to play. You got to gel. You got to get confidence. But I would like to see this team stay together and win and lose together, like the Islanders did in the '80s. That team grew up together.
They did. Now there was no free agency then, so it was easier to keep that team together. But this team is young. I like John Davidson. He's done a good job both in St. Louis and Columbus when he was with those two teams respectively. I think that they're rebuilding the right way, which is something that the Rangers historically are not known for. How many over-the-hill future Hall of Famers were brought in at the end of their career to try to end that Stanley Cup drought, and you can go back to Phil Esposito, Boom Boom Geoffrion if you want to go even further back, Guy Lafleur, Marcel Dion, so many names, people who have come through the Garden and didn't quite bring home the Holy Grail, but now they're showing some patience. I think that they're doing things the right way. And to me, I don't expect the Rangers to make the playoffs this year, but I think the key is, are they playing significantly better hockey in March and April than they are in October and November? And if the answer to that is yes, and they find a couple of guys who are going to be key pieces and get them experience and get them confidence, I think playoffs are possible next year. And I think, like I said, this team is heading in the right direction.
What do you think about Lundqvist? Is he going to be here after the trading deadline?
It'll depend on where the Rangers are. And, I almost, and I was wondering what both of you thought about this, sort of the parallels between Henrik Lundqvist and Eddie Giacomin, both guys who are going to probably, Giacomin's in the Hall of Fame. I think Henrik will end up in the Hall of Fame. Guys who pretty much did everything for the New York Rangers except win a Stanley Cup. Got them to the finals once, but didn't win it. I really, almost in a sad way, see a lot of parallels between Lundqvist and Eddie Giacomin.
Yeah. Well, with Lundqvist, this year, I don't think he's going to get the opportunity to get into a groove because he likes to play a lot. And I think this year they're going to want to see what Georgiev can do and the other Russian kids.
Well, there comes a time when you have to look to the future.
That's right.
Lundqvist is not any younger. He's not getting any younger. No. And they have to look for down the road for a replacement. It's like the Giants, the football Giants, had to draft a young quarterback, and he's out there playing now while Eli Manning stands on the sidelines. There comes a time when you have to change. You have to make a change.
And it'll be interesting to see if John Davidson pulls the trigger on a deal at the trade deadline, because I think it is better for the Rangers in the long run to move on from Henrik Lundqvist and get something for him while they still can. As painful as that would be to Rangers fans. And look, I mean, even Brian Leach, you know, the Hall of Fame defenseman, the former captain, they traded him at the end of his career as well. So, you know, for the good of the team in the long run, as difficult a pill as that would be to swallow for a lot of fans and probably for Henrik himself, the Rangers organization is probably better off getting something for him and moving on from him sooner rather than later. It's just a question of whether or not they'll actually pull the trigger on something like that.
Well, they always say it's better to trade somebody too early, 1 year too early.
A year early rather than a year late. That's correct.
Yeah. Also, in 2021, you have another NHL team coming in, so there's going to be another draft, and you can probably only protect one goaltender. So they have to decide who out of these young kids now they're going to hang on to. You know.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting decision. They've got a couple of seasons to try to figure that out and see where it goes. But and then you may have a situation where you don't bring up a young goalie, so he doesn't need to be protected, depending on what the rules end up being for the expansion draft.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they might have a number of games that they're allowed to play, and then they have to be protected. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, gentlemen, I think we did okay tonight. Anybody else have anything else to say about the Ranger Islander rivalries?
Let's hope they meet in the playoffs again.
Yeah, that would be an amazing thing for hockey in this area, no question.
Yeah.
It would. Thanks for an interesting evening, Gil.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Hal, thank you for being on with me. Gil,
sure,
thank
George.
you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure having you on. We'll be in touch.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye now.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
The proceeding has been a comfortably zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.